Okay. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jean and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator. Huge welcome to you for attending today's Kaffeeklatsch with leZlie Lee Kim and Ty Sloane in conversation. Closed captioning is available for you if you would like. If you go down on the bottom of your screen, there'll be a more button with 3 little dots, or there'll just be the closed captioning button. You can press that and then you can move around the little chat box wherever you like. We also have ASL interpretation that will be spotlit for the entire event for your convenience. A huge thank you to Age Friendly University for funding this program. This is our 5th and final Kaffeeklatsch, and it has been just an incredible, enriching experience, and just goes to show how important intergenerational learning is. I would like to now chat with you about the land that you're on and your relationship to that land and its original caretakers. I'm speaking on behalf of the School of Art, the School of Art Gallery, the University of Manitoba, located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect these treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the past harms and continual and ongoing violence of settler colonialism on Indigenous peoples. As an educator and outreach coordinator of the Art Gallery, I will continue to prioritize the work, stories, and programming of Indigenous artists, Black artists, and people of color. I'd now like to introduce you to leZlie Lee Kim and Ty Sloane, who are gracious enough to let us have an ear into their conversation today. I'll put their bios in the chat and you are welcome to read them whenever you'd like. You can also look them up online. They have a great online presence, with leZlie having her website and Ty very, very well known on Instagram. So I'll hand it over to you two, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Jean.
Thank you, Jean.
And thank you to SOAG. Is that how you pronounce it? SOAG?
Yes. Yes.
And the University of Manitoba for having Ty and myself this afternoon. It's a lovely opportunity. And thank you to our 2 ASL interpreters to make access possible.
Yes, miigwech.
So Ty, do you want to jump right in?
Sure.
Okay,
After you.
Let's take it away. So I'm sure people want to know, how did we meet?
In 2016, at Buddies in Bad Times Theater here in Toronto, 3 people, leZlie, Vanessa, and Evelyn, decided to do a project about youth and elder relationships and what it means to build a relationship with each other within a queer community. And I happen to be a youth. I still am a youth, at least according to Ontario. And leZlie is an older youth.
I like that, an older youth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to
Okay, yeah. So we met through YEP, which is the Youth Elders Project. So that was created in September of 2016 by Buddies in Bad Times Theater, which is one of the longest running queer theaters in North America, but as Jean said, probably in the world. And you can tell by my lovely accent, I'm from Trinidad. You can see my Trini flag in the background, that I'm from a different part of the world. So we have sort of a unique relationship because Ty is one of the queer youth from the project. I am one of the 6 queer seniors in the project. There were 13 of us all together. And that's how we met. So we call it an unlikely relationship, but it's become very strong since we met. And now we work together, co-facilitating a monthly session, which is called In Conversation. There's a different topic every month, and we actually have one coming up in April the 18th. I like to plug our stuff. April the 18th, and it's going to be 6 to 8 p.m. Toronto time, which is 4 to 6 p.m. No, 6 to 8, yeah. Toronto, 5 to 7. I have just lost it. Anyway, you can look us up.
Manitoba time.
Yeah, 5 to 7 Manitoba time. You can check out the Buddies website. And are we still connected? Yes, we're definitely still connected through the project, and I support Ty's work as much as I can. It's been a little difficult since COVID, and things are opening up again here in Toronto and I guess across Canada. But I am not, because I'm immunocompromised, I have to be careful about going out to public events. So I am hoping to be able to support Ty when they're out doing their many different artistic endeavors.
I should add that while leZlie and I are connected, not necessarily all 13 of us from that original project are. Some of the youth have gone on to do different pursuits and projects, and some of the elders do still come to our In Conversation series, and some have moved away. So, yeah.
Yes.
I wonder if we can shift, leZlie, to, I want to know, what are your values, and how do you think that you and I kind of align with those?
Well, for me, what I see of my values reflected in you, honesty, truth, caring, kindness, respect, compassion, especially. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I would echo that myself. And I also think you're tenacious, you're stubborn, you are a leader. You're a leader while you navigate a multiplicity of challenges and accesses, whether that be your own body challenges, or whether that you're advocating on behalf of a huge population of community.
Oh, thank you. And the same goes for you.
Sure.
Because I have seen such a huge amount of growth in you as a person and as an artist since you came onto the Toronto scene through Buddies. And you have done a tremendous amount of leadership in your role as a curator when Pride was still physical, and continuing to do work in our many communities. So for me, when I see that in somebody, and I feel that's why it's so easy for me to work with you, because we share so many similar values.
I wonder if you can speak a little bit about who your communities are.
Well, I'm famous for saying communities, because too often when we are having conversations about the 2S LGBTQ community, I have to say to people, well, I live in many communities, as you can tell from the color of my skin and my lovely Trini accent. I am in brown communities. I am in Trini communities. Mostly Trini communities are straight, but I am discovering and helping to create queer Trini communities. I am older now, so I'm in senior communities, and I have my trusty mobility device here, Robin, one of many that I have. And so I am in disability communities. I also do a lot of organizing and advocating for queer seniors. So that's another community in which I exist. And what are your communities, Ty?
That's a good question. You know what's interesting about that question is that I don't often name my communities to people. But I think if I were to quantify them now, I think as a non-binary two-spirit person, I can step into gay male spaces. I try to foster and work within trans spaces and prioritizing racialized Black, Indigenous, and other newcomers or folks of color who are trying to be and thrive and connect. And then as a multidisciplinary artist, I get to tap into different artistic queer communities because a huge mandate of mine has been to foster the 2S LGBTQIA plus with regards to that intersecting racialized communities, because I feel so often when we come from a various amount of intersections, we experience different oppressions. But I wouldn't say that I'm in all of that. Like I've had a niche community, given that I can definitely step into some Indigenous spaces. I can step into some Asian spaces. I can step into some brown spaces, but I wouldn't say all, because communities are small and they're small in terms of who's showing up and organizing, but then so big when it comes to actual individuals, because there's an immense amount of, I think, people in Toronto, which could be reflected in other cities, where some folks are racialized and queer and then don't even know about our community spaces or events or places to be.
Yeah, it's interesting how you have named your communities. I mean, we share similar communities, and yet we have separate communities that we both exist in. But for me, it's important that we recognize that there is more than one community, more than one 2S LGBTQ community out there. And that's something I want people to reflect on. So talking about communities, I'm curious because I know you have had a foot in Winnipeg and a foot in other places. How did you end up in Toronto?
I have a very unique experience, and I owe that a lot to the matriarchs, the women in my life. I'm a transracial adoptee, which pretty much means that my Indigenous mother gave me up for adoption and a white lady chose to adopt me. And then I have a Black godmother. And so that's important to name because I'm on a reconnecting journey with my birth family, but my godmother lived in Winnipeg, and my mom, who raised me, the white lady, was based in Alberta. And so growing up, I had the opportunity to bounce between central Alberta and Winnipeg, but it's not as, I would say the early 2000s and the 2010s were not as progressive or safe or or had access to knowledge to be as mindful and supportive, or to try to action allyship. And so it was difficult growing up. I experienced an immense amount of racism, an immense amount of displacement. I always say that this is going to be contested, but I'll say it in this.
Go for it.
Folks who had the privilege and the immense privilege to grow up with their birth family, whether that be like you as a res Indigenous person, or perhaps you as a first, second, third Asian generation Canadian person, they got to grow up in their culture. And I did not, because I grew up by this. She's fantastic, but she's a biker and a trucker, and she's white. She comes from Scottish European descent, and she has done a brilliant job of raising me and loving me. But I could not escape the immense amount of, whether institutional or peer, discrimination and oppression. So by the time I graduated from college in 2014, I was craving something a little bit different. And it wouldn't be until 2019 when I had a colleague of mine who was also moving to Toronto be like, do you want to come to Toronto? And I had been curious about it. I also been a little bit snobby about Toronto. I think the rest of the country has a lot of opinions about this city, and I think rightfully so. But I had a mentor who was like, well, you know what? Why don't you just write a list of all the yeses and write a list of all the nos? And it was through my self-reflection of the yeses that I was like, well, I know that the Anishinaabe Nation is based in Toronto, as well as like around the Great Lakes. But as far as I knew at the time, they were for sure in Toronto, and Indigenous people were being fostered with care and access and community building in a way that perhaps in a rural or res situation they hadn't been. And as an artist, I wanted to be an actor. I grew up watching film and television, really craving to see myself reflected. And sure, there was like Adam Beach, prolific actor, but he wasn't queer and he wasn't feminine. And I didn't feel like he represented me. And for a while, because of my adoption journey and displacement, I didn't also know that I was Asian for the longest time. So I didn't really look towards Asian media or culture to be reflected of. And rather, because I was in more conservative places, I experienced a lot of internal racism when it came to my Asian identity, because growing up, I didn't know that that was part of my identity. And so I wanted to be queer. I wanted to be queer, and I wanted to foster my Indigenous community and reconnect in a deeper way, and thread my queerness and my art and my ethnic culture together so that I could do the kind of art making and storytelling that I craved so desperately. And so in 2016, when this colleague of mine was like, come to Toronto with me, there were so many yeses, and the only no was money. And I did grow up in a very low income, poverty neighborhood within central Alberta, in the town that I grew up in. But my grandmother, who was the mother of the white lady who raised me, she was an accountant, and she said, you will always find a way to money. There will be a way. Money will come, and there might be a lot of strife and challenge and hardship. But if the only thing that is helping foster your growth and your full self is money, then go anyways, and you will find a way. And then I did. And then now I'm here. Yeah. How did you come all the way from the Caribbean up to Canada, leZlie?
I came on a plane. I know people say, so how did you come here? And I came on a plane. I like to tell white people that I came on a plane. So I ended up here in 1970 because my parents were separated in Trinidad in 1965. And in a very unusual something for a woman to do. In 1964, my mother left our family. She left my father and she left me and my three brothers, and she went back to live with her father because she felt that my father could not give her the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. My father is what we call brown Chinese in Trinidad, working class. And my mother came from a very privileged and rich background. So she just left us. And so when she left, the separation agreement was that I would stay with my father in Trinidad until I finished high school. And my mother made many journeys trying to find herself and ended up in Toronto in 1969. And as soon as I finished high school in Trinidad in 1970, I finished high school in May, and by July, I was on a plane to Toronto. And I had never heard of Toronto before until my mother came to live here. So that's how I ended up here, kicking and screaming, leaving my family behind and all my friends and my way of living to come to this foreign country at the age of 16. So you came in 2016 and I came here at the age of 16. Ah, see how that aligned?
Synchronicity, truly.
Yeah. So that was huge for me because it was a huge culture shock for me coming here. And what was interesting, I met my mother's friends, and so she was sharing a house with four other Trinis. That's what we call ourselves, Trinis. And so what was fascinating for us was that there were white people doing all the jobs that we were accustomed to seeing people like us doing in Trinidad. So garbage was being taken out by white people, roads being repaired by white people. So there was that fascination. But then when I got into high school, what happens when you come from another country and you have to enter high school, your grades are submitted to the Ministry of Education in whichever province you're going into. And then they decide where to place you in their education system. And I came from the British system of education, and I had finished the equivalent of O levels, which was grade 12. And when I got here, I expected to go into grade 13, but the Ministry of Education said no, because I didn't do math. They put me into grade 10. So there was that. And then I found out that the value of education here was not important. I can't even say it wasn't as important, it just was not important. And in Trinidad at the time, and it still is to a certain extent, education is the highest value we have in terms of parents saying they want their children to have a better life, and the best way to do that is through school and education. So going into the classroom here was a shock because the kids just had no respect for teachers. And also I came from a convent school, 5 years with nuns. The nuns made me a lesbian. It's a whole other story. So going into a co-ed situation was also a culture shock. And I was bullied mercilessly by the boys.
For your queerness or for your race?
For my race and the way that I spoke. So when I came here in Trinidad, we speak very quickly. but I had to slow down. It took me about a year to slow down how I spoke. And when I go back to Trinidad now to visit, sometimes I can't even understand what Trinidadians are saying. And I forgot how quickly we speak. So that's something I had to learn how to do, is to slow down how I spoke. And then I became a comedian to fit in, because I was being bullied, and the only way to get them, off of my back literally was to make jokes. So that's how I try to fit in. And, I got things like, oh, so you used to live in a tree, and did you ever wear clothes? And I said, you know what, you're right. I used to live in a tree. This is the first time I'm wearing shoes. I didn't even know what a house was. And then they started laughing, and then that sort of broke the ice. And then they started calling me a browner. And I thought, oh, so finally they're noticing that I'm brown, because back in 1970 and for many years after that, if you were not white, you were black. And in Trinidad, we distinguish our races. So you're Chinese, or you're black, or you're Indo, or you're brown. And so here you were just black if you weren't white. So when they started calling me a browner, I thought, this is great. They're recognizing that I'm brown. And then I started hearing brown nose. And I thought, okay, now they're focusing on my brown nose. And then I came to find out that browner and brown nose meant you were kissing up to the teachers. And because I was so far ahead education-wise, grade 10 was nothing for me, because you do all your homework. That's what we were taught to do. So that was another shock for me, what that actually meant. And at the end of grade 10, they wanted to put me into grade 11, and I went to guidance, and I went to the principal, and I said, no, I'm not. I'm going into grade 13, or I'm leaving school. And in retrospect, my mother and I had a huge fight about that, because she kept saying, do what they tell you to do. And in retrospect, I realized that was my first piece of advocating for myself and for protesting. But at the time, I didn't see it as that. It was that they can't do this to me. It's not fair. So that's when it all started. And so I've been here now 52 years. And everything, yep. I'm a lot older than I look. And so I've seen such a huge change in Toronto, but unfortunately, the racism is still there. It's more subtle now, but it's still there. And I'm hoping that in my lifetime, things will get better.
What would that look like?
For me, it would be that we're not constantly having to fight for equality for Indigenous people and Black folks. The rest of us are accepted to a certain extent, but why is it always Indigenous people whose land we're living on, and Black folks who were brought here as a result of slavery? So these two groups who are so oppressed, for me, that would look, freedom would be that both groups, especially Indigenous people, would have their land back, and Black people would not constantly be afraid of being shot at or pulled, arrested. Mm-hmm. That's what it would look like for me. Yeah.
It's so interesting. So because my mom raised me predominantly as a single mother, but I had a slew, maybe not a slew, maybe slew is like too big of a word. I had a couple stepfathers. So in my very formative years, when I was about 2 to when I was about 7, I had the opportunity to live in New Zealand for a little while because of my stepfather, who gave us that kind of security and financial access. And he was Maori himself. And so I had this interesting opportunity that before I could have memory in terms of language. We remember things in language, but when we're young, when we're babies, we remember it based on feelings. I don't remember what it was like to live in Winnipeg for those first little while. And so when I began to learn language and create my memories as a human during that time, I experienced growing up with Indigenous Maori people in New Zealand, in Paihia and in Auckland. And there was some family emergency that brought us back to Canada in 1999, which is what led me to then bounce between Central Alberta and Winnipeg. But I experienced a similar moment that you named, but not in high school, in my like very early elementary school. Because New Zealand at the time enrolls their children into school sooner, I had done grade 1 a couple of times, and not because one time because our school burnt down in New Zealand. And so then we had to take a pause for a year while that was facilitated. But when we came back to Canada, one of the ways that Canada first showed to me in my recent memory its systemic racism is that they put me into speech impediment classes. And they also wanted to put me into grade 2 or grade 3, which was 1 or 2 years older than I am. And already within the way that they kind of put folks into school, my birthday's later in the year. And so already I was kind of young, comparable to who my classmates were with my same age group. But they also wanted to do that. And I even remember my mom being like, no, Ty needs to be with their age group because otherwise they'll experience bullying. And then I did anyways, because I learned how to speak in New Zealand, I came with a Maori accent. So they put me into speech impediment classes, and then I got bullied. And when I finally had the Canadian English accent, then they began to forget that I was even from New Zealand. And that's for me when a lot of the anti-Asian and anti-Indigenous racism began. And then it just built through my elementary into junior high school and college years. And so it was really interesting that you named that, because I think we are in the last couple of years have been afforded enough knowledge and access as racialized people to stand up against a lot of white supremacy. But I experienced so much racism from people older than me and people my own age. And I think white people forget that. I think they're like, well, we're learning now. I'm like, but you have now traumatized me for my whole life. And the way that I engage with authority or try to find safety or what have you will always be impacted. There was a TikTok, love TikTok. There was a TikTok I found, but an anti-racist, anti-oppressive educator brought up that a huge reason why our education system doesn't include the images of all of the racism that Canada did is because kids would see their grandparents and parents, right? Even my mom and my grandmother born in the 30s and my mom born in the 60s, the white family, I know that they were racist, and they've come a long way, especially because of me and loving me and wanting to be in solidarity and an ally with me growing up. But that's one thing that I always think about is that white folks across Canada come from an experience of being racist, and they so often forget that. And they especially forget that when they're in academia, because they have the class privilege of getting to have all the access, to have the theory, to do better. And so it was just really interesting that you brought that up, because I experienced that too. I also experienced the indoctrination of not Catholicism, but of Christianity, and had that own impact. And when I came through puberty in high school, I used to be a youth band leader. So for the youth group, for the kids, for our church, they would kind of filter different singers and musicians in. And I used to be like a backup singer for the really talented Christian kids. But once they found out that I was bisexual, because at the time I firmly believed that I was bisexual, mostly because I had a fear that I was going to have a straight midlife crisis if I came out as gay. And I didn't want to deal with that. The ripe age of 16. But my youth pastor found out that I was gay and then booted me out of the church. And that's for me when like my like break from Christianity happened, because not only was I experiencing homophobia, but I was already experiencing racism from the church.
It's interesting when you said you were booted out, because from the time I realized that I was a lesbian, which lasted about 3 days, and I discovered dyke, so I identify as a queer dyke. I used to go with my mother. Well, I'm a Catholic in recovery after, being oppressed by the nuns for 5 years. And then I remember distinctly going with my mother to Christmas Eve Mass, and the priest standing and in the sermon saying, all homosexuals are going to burn in hell. And I got up and I walked out and went to wait at the back, because I had driven my mother there and had to take her back home. And she didn't come out. And my two brothers were sitting there with her. They knew that I was a dyke. They didn't leave. They just sat there. And then they came out at the end and they berated me. I said, why, how disrespectful to get up and walk out in the middle of the sermon. And I said, but did you hear what he said? We're all going to burn in hell. And they said, oh, well, that's not you, that's them. I said, but I'm one of them. But the other piece I wanted to get back to that you just talked about, that we share, is the accent thing. So when you said you came back with a Maori accent, and my Trini accent isn't going anywhere. And just for everybody listening today, everybody here has an accent. And in terms of subtle racism, so I'm sure what happens to you sometimes is you have a Canadian accent, but when people meet you and they see you as not white because you're mixed race. When they hear me on the phone and they meet me, they immediately assume that I'm going to be Black. Now, I have a lot of family, a lot of my nieces and nephews who are brown like me were born here, so they have Canadian accents. And they apply for a job and they have an interview, and then they show up and they're told, sorry, and you're Black. And they say, well, you interviewed me on the phone and I got the job. But when they see you, they're not expecting a person of color to have a white accent. And that's so subtle in terms of how racism plays out. And just like you are asking people here today to pay attention, I'm also asking you to pay attention to how subtle racism is playing out. When you listen to somebody on the phone and then you meet them in person, the assumptions and judgments that you make, so please be mindful of that.
When I was in college in Central Alberta, I was wanting to become an actor. And so my voice teacher in my second year was very fixated and supported on wanting to help me have a full standard American dialect, which is like the kind of dialect that you see with American and Canadian television and film. And I found out in that class that Canada has about 7 dialects across, and probably more, I would assume. But it was so interesting because I obviously have an effeminate voice. There's a little bit of a lisp there. There's a little bit of raspiness there. And when I was doing private kind of like tutoring and coaching with this teacher, he was getting so frustrated. He was like, I don't understand why your voice is doing that. We were trying to figure out the mechanics. And so then he got me to do a British accent, and he heard a different kind of tonal quality. It came out clearer, it came out more rich and resonant. But it wasn't quite it. And so he started to go through all of the different accents that have come through the impact of the crown, to where he ended up finding the dialect that exists in New Zealand. And he was like, mimic this. And I did, and my voice shifted. And it was resonant, and it was loud, and it was clear. And I wanted to add that, because that one way that I will walk for a long time now with the impact of racism from my formative years is now through my voice. And so my voice is an example of racial trauma that I experienced from this country and education system.
And that's a good segue into us both being mixed race. Hey.
What? Unheard of.
So not only are we mixed race, we are mixed cultures.
Yes.
So who are you as a mixed race person?
That's such a good question. So I'm an Anishinaabe, Chinese, and then like white European. The white European being British, French, Scottish, a little bit of the other Western European, just like small amounts. But I walked through most of my life believing that I was half Indigenous and half white. And for that matter, half Ojibwe and half white. So I walked through, at least in Alberta, up until 2016, being like, I'm in all this white space and I'm one of the few tokens that exist. But when coming to Toronto being known as this like melting pot that I'm sure you're aware of, there was this wild experience of being like, wow, not only am I mixed race, but I also don't get to just be mixed race even in my own communities. There is a standard that I think exists in each ethnic culture that is either unspoken about or spoken about, depending on how you go into it. And for me, I'm for the first couple of years, I didn't know that I was which kind of Asian. When you first met me, actually, I was like, I don't know. And because I was so racially ambiguous with my Asian ancestry, I was like, maybe I'm Filipino because of the huge migration of Filipinx individuals. I was like, maybe I could be any. And this is a very contentious thing, but I wanted to use ancestry DNA because as an adoptee, it is so difficult in this country to figure out not only who your birth family was, but how to get your original birth certificate and how to claim that kind of like ethnic culture. And so doing that ancestry DNA test, I connected actually over the last couple of years with some relatives where I've been able to trace the migration that happened. I can now trace the migration that happened where my Chinese side and my Anishinaabe side came together in Kenora, Ontario, and in Winnipeg, where I was born. And I can now trace back through the migration of the Chinese side back to Guangzhou, China, which is cool. But I also, you mentioned culturally, I was raised as a prairie kind of white boy, despite the fact that I'm not. But I was raised looking at white boys and white men, and that being my model of how to be in the world. And even with Indigenous communities, there is some very, very intense tension that exists for folks who had the opportunity and privilege to grow up on the res. And I understand that folks who grew up on the res experience different kinds of oppression, but they will always have had the opportunity to grow up with their blood family, and that is a privilege on this land, to be able to grow up with your blood family and know elders and know teachings or know where you come from, and that the land that you're on is where you come from, is such a privilege that doesn't get talked about very often. I now experience and have peers and community where there's huge conversations about what it means to be acclaimed Indian or an unclaimed Indian, or to be reconnecting or researching, or to be in this term, it's called pretendian, where folks who maybe have a distant ancestry to indigenous cultures are taking up arts and culture leadership and ceremony. And so there's a huge, I exist in a huge tension within the indigenous communities across Canada, let alone the Anishinaabe Nation here, let alone my Ojibwe background. And so when I get to walk as a mixed race person, I get told who I am or who I'm not. Very rarely do I get supported in who I am. And that was one thing that I experienced with you, leZlie, and with Lila Pine, who's Mi'kmaq, who we met through the Youth Elders Project, is you two were the first folks that were like, your entirety of your ethnic experience and your diasporic experience is valid, and we support you. And I had the immense privilege of, in like 2017, I think, having Lila Pine be like, you're a two-spirit person. It was right around that time too that I was coming into my non-binary identity. How do you navigate being a mixed race person?
Well, it's interesting. I share a lot of similarities with you in terms of my racial mixture. So I'm called, in Trinidad, I'm called a Callaloo, which is a very particular mixed race person like I am. And Callaloo is one of our national food dishes that's made up of many ingredients. So Trinidad, the island of Trinidad, so our country is made up of two islands, Trinidad and Tobago, but Trinidad in particular is an island that was the most colonized in the world. So my background is Chinese. My great-grandfather came as a businessman from Hong Kong to Trinidad in the very early 1800s. And back then there were the Caribs, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. And so he married a Carib princess. So, you know, I knew I came from royalty. I mean, from way back when. And so on the other side, that's my father's side. And also on my father's side, there's the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese. And on my mother's side, it's also the Portuguese and indentured laborers. So when slavery was abolished in the Caribbean, the plantation owners and the British brought over indentured laborers from India. So that's another part of who I am. And what was interesting when you talked about, you know, people looking at you and deciding who you are racially, I remember the first time I took the subway in Toronto, and I was terrified because I'm going underground to get onto this machine that's, you know, just, you know, how safe am I going to be? And so I get on, and there's this, well, they're all white people. And this one woman in particular kept looking at me and smiling. And so I'm thinking, you know, I'm just going to keep my head down, stay out of trouble. And then she comes over and she sits right next to me. And she looks at me and she says, "You are so good looking. Are you from Burma?" So luckily I knew where Burma was. And I said, "No, I'm from Trinidad." And she said, "Oh no, you must mean Jamaica." Because back then, that's the only island they knew that people used to go to on holidays. So, you know, when, I'm sure you experience this too, when you're mixed race like you and I are, because we have unusual combinations, you become exoticized. Because, you know, it's like they want to touch you. I know people wanting to touch my hair and hear me speak, but it's a blessing and a curse for me being mixed race, because I fit into many places, but I belong really nowhere. And I've heard you say, you know, the same thing. Also, part of that for you is your indigeneity and that kind of trying to find home. So that's what that's like for me. So yeah, it's been interesting. Still, I find there's this exoticism when I'm out with my Black friends, how I'm treated, or with my Indigenous or Two-Spirit friends, how I'm treated differently, and always having to stand up and say, listen, you can't be doing this, you know? The people I'm with are people. They're not just, you know, to be discriminated against. So for me, it's when I'm out in the world, I have a responsibility and a privilege to stand up for my friends who are having to experience still what's going on here in Toronto, even though we're such a, you know, the most diverse city in the world right now.
Well, and we're like one of the most diverse cities in the world, kind of also because of colonization. I had a friend of mine, I don't know a lot about it, but I did have a friend of mine say that there's a huge connection between the Caribbean and Toronto. Like a huge migration has been happening for time. And the Caribbean Torontonians make up a huge demographic of folks in this city. Yeah. One thing that I've begun to think about a lot about is I was fortunate enough to be in a presentation where Elder Lauren Bluewaters was speaking, and I might be getting this not totally word for word, but they name that like you kind of choose as a spirit before you're born where you're gonna be. And I think about that often because I'm like, well, humanity can be awful sometimes, and so why would I choose to be here? But there's something that I'm kind of working through a little bit, and that's my journey and my ancestors who are with me, who are from those European countries and from China and who are Ojibwe. They are stronger than the systemic racism and the intergenerational trauma of all people on this planet.
I totally agree with you. Totally. So you had mentioned a little while back in one of your answers about identifying as bisexual, so you didn't end up in a being old in a straight relationship. So when did you know that you were queer or that you were gay when you first identified as such?
Yeah, you know what's funny? I think my inner curator was present when I was young because I always had feelings and crushes on boys. I always did. And I always tried to curate who my crushes should be when it came to girls. It was always like, if I liked girls as much as I like boys, this is who they would be. And this is who I would want them to look like. And so I would say I knew about my attraction to men, despite how tragic men are. I think when I was like 5 or 6, I always knew. But then that migration back from New Zealand to Canada, and then the racism, and then because I am proudly a femme, I'm an effeminate person, and I'm more oftentimes not shy, and I'm curvaceous, I never pursued it. And even when I did pursue it come puberty, I was kept as a secret a lot of the time. And so I think I came out as bisexual because as I had access to the internet. So that's how I came into like the queer community, is that I was beginning to try to like sneakily watch queer movies or queer television shows or research a little bit. And I was always like, well, if I'm bisexual and I keep all the doors open, then maybe I will be safer. And then it wasn't actually until I was in college when I had gay white men bully me into coming out as gay that I came out as gay. And even now that I'm like firm and confident in my gender identity, I would still lean a little bit on the bisexuality and even the demisexuality, which means that you need an attraction to someone after you have a bond with them, like an emotional tie or what have you. I would even say I still am, because I feel like so many people I have met that I've been attracted to have been other genders. And so I'm not necessarily just attracted to cis gay men. So I would say that maybe I would say more often than not that I'm a queer person when it comes to my sexuality, because I want to continue to expand and be mindful of the ever-growing language and opportunity to meet people and have them introduce themselves to me and who they are when it comes to their gender. What about you?
Well, it's interesting when you talked about the internet, because I was 19. I was in a very clandestine relationship with a friend who happened to be female. And we didn't use the word lesbian. We were together for 3 years while we were both in university. And we had to go to an encyclopedia to find out. You had the internet, we had encyclopedias back then. There was no internet. And what stands out for me when we did the Youth Elders Project, when we first met, when the elders met the youth, we did that speed dating thing. And I remember sitting across from one of the queer youth, I won't say their name, and I said, so how do you identify? And they said, I'm a pansexual. And I said, so and I could only just learn the word. And I said, so when did you know? And they said, oh, when I was 14. I said, but how would you even know something like that? And they said, oh, the internet, So it's so different now, figuring out or finding out what the options are and what all these different identities are and what it means when you are questioning yourself. So it wasn't until I actually went to the Lesbian Organization of Toronto in 1976. And I was told, because I wanted to meet lesbians, and I went there and I was told, well, you have to choose. You have to choose between being butch, femme, or a separatist. And back then, the only separatists I knew were from Quebec. And I said, well, why would Quebec separatists be part of this whole lesbian thing? And they said, oh, no, separatists are women who remove themselves from men, any contact with men in their lives. And I said, well, I can't be a separatist. I have a father and 3 brothers. And I don't know about this butch femme thing. And then, so I was a lesbian, like I said, for about 3 or 4 days. And then as I started going back to the house, it was a house on Jarvis Street in Toronto, I started hearing the word dyke. And I said, well, what does that mean? And they said, oh, those dykes, they're always protesting something. They always want to make change. And I said, that's me. So I've been a dyke ever since. And there was only, I would say in 2016, when I started hanging out with a lot more queer youth, that I started using queer, because for me, that's a political statement more so than a sexual orientation. So I identify as a queer dyke. Yeah. So I'm just being mindful of the time. So what do you think about the history of the word queer? Because when I do my presentations, I'm always mindful and respectful of using that word, because it was used against us. I mean, when I came out, nobody used that word back in the 70s. And then because it was used against us, it was like, it was derogatory, it was the worst thing you could possibly be. And then as I started, time started changing, and now the word queer has been reclaimed and is now embraced by everybody. So what do you think?
I would maybe argue that maybe queer is not embraced by everyone.
Well, more so.
And I say that because growing up in my high school and even my college years, I had men in their pickup trucks call me a faggot or queer, or to try to be derogatory and violent to me. And I think having had the opportunity to connect with newcomers or refugees from other countries, I still think that queer lives in this complex place that we're kind of speaking about. Because I didn't identify with queer until I came to Toronto. And in Toronto, I think more than other metropolis cities within Canada, we have the like immense privilege to gather and spend time and connect with queer history, queer global history, Toronto queer history, and that intersectional intersections. And I think it's claimed more now, or I witness it being also claimed again in major cities that are as progressive as Toronto is, and specifically in community organizing or arts and culture, where people are brave and confident in using that identity. So for me, I discovered it in 2016, and because even now, when I tell my grandmother, she's almost 90, she like gets so taken aback, and it upsets her when I use that word, because for her it's still a derogatory word. In her eyes, her grandchild is calling themselves a derogatory thing, but I'm like, no, it's us reclaiming language. But I think being globalized as a queer international community and having the opportunity to connect over social media and the internet, and now in this city, we get to have this kind of like opportunity to reclaim words that have been used to violently harm us. And I think there are elders, or the in-betweeners, the tweens, as you call them, the ones who are like 30 to 65, who have done such immense amount of great work for youth like myself or younger to be like, we can reclaim queer because all of you are, and you're paving that way.
Yeah, it's true how queer is used in different communities, because I work with a lot of LGBTQ newcomers, and that's not a word that they are using that I have heard. But also coming out, we talk about coming out as being such a big thing. And I always have to remind people that coming out is such a privilege. It's a North American white European concept, because living in Trinidad and in many countries of color around the world, you don't dare come out because you could end up dead. Simple as that. So for folks who are listening, just to be aware that coming out is not an easy thing to do, and it is a very privileged thing to do. And I just wanted to add a quick story here about my accent and the word queer. So I was, a couple of years ago, I was speaking to a Black person from the States who is gay. And I was talking about being queer, and he said, "Oh, so are you using that term here now?" And I said, "Queer? Yes." And he says, "Queer, Quare." And I said, "No, Queer." And he said, "Well, in the amounts certain Black, gay, and lesbian communities in the States, their word for queer is Quare. So they have come up with that to describe themselves, because they find that the word queer is, comes from this white privilege space. So that's something that I discovered. But
well, I just quickly pulled something up, and just for like context to those who are bearing witness, it's still illegal to even fight for LGBTQI liberation in 71 different countries around the world.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, especially because of this kind of cultural standing where Canada sits, a lot of those queer people come to Toronto to like seek refuge and live a life
Mm-hmm.
that you and I get to live now and have been able to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, we've been working together now for a long time, almost 7 years. And how do you think I can support you as a queer younger friend?
These are two things that I think not only you, but also other elders never stop learning everything. You don't get to finish high school or college or a program and then stop learning, because you choosing to stop learning will have an impact on everyone else. Leads me to maybe a lighter one is don't stop learning about technology. Technology is a tool that our communities use in the pandemic, for culture, for history, where we've been able to connect. And so I would say don't stop learning generally. And then also, if you can and you can find that support, keep up with technology, because technology is at least in a Western country, where you have the ability to use technology.
Well, I have to say that I have learned, and very quickly, because in March of 2020, I had no idea what Zoom was. And by the end of April, I had an iPad, which was given to me by a friend because she bought a new one. I didn't even know what an iPad was. I had a cell phone and I had to learn Zoom. And now I know like 4 or 5 different platforms. So believe me, I'm learning. And one of the things I want to learn this year is how to do my own PowerPoints. And I get a lot of support from my queer young friends who are great with technology. So yeah, those of us older queer folks are trying our best.
How can I continue to support both you as well as other queer seniors?
One of the things I would say is what you and I have going for us is learning from each other and how to mutually support each other, because I am very frustrated when I speak to people who are my age, who are queer and who are older than me, and they say to me, oh, I don't know why you hang around with all those queer young people. They have it so easy. They just come out, they no big deal, they have no clue what we went through. And I say to them, we have a lot of similarities. It's easier to come out, but it's not easy to be out. It's not easy to survive. It's not easy for housing. It's not easy for work. All of my queer young friends are working more than one job. At least they're working at least 3 jobs. None of you have your own housing. You're all sharing housing. And when you start sharing housing, you don't know who you're living with. Yeah. So for me, that's, a huge safety issue. And when I first came out and I was in the workforce, I had the privilege of having a full-time job for 10 years. That isn't happening anymore. There are no full-time jobs. They're all contracts. There are no benefits. So I'm constantly educating my older queer friends to say we have to be more supportive of queer youth, because we were here, we paved the way, but we still have to be there to support them. So what would you say moving forward? Where would you envision yourself? Now we've talked about where we came from or what we're doing now. Where do you see yourself in about 3 years?
Wow, what a brilliant question. I want to be innovating arts and culture sectors for racialized and queer people across the world. I would hope that in 3 years, I'm moving from one nation to another nation and continuing that journey. Because I know that arts and culture is one of the biggest ways that we gather as community. And I know that as we begin to gather as communities, we encounter each other's individual or intergenerational or community traumas. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think my role in that could be utilizing storytelling and performance and art to work through that, both here in Toronto and in other places where I will hopefully have the opportunity to do so. How about you?
Well, when you and I had this conversation about a month ago, I remember saying to you, well, you know, I don't know how much longer I can keep up doing this work. And then a situation came up in the middle of February where I found out that there's homophobic abuse happening in a long-term care home here in the city of Toronto that belongs to the city of Toronto. And that just got me so angry and so infuriated that now my mission is to make sure that all of the long-term care homes in the city of Toronto and all of the long-term care homes in the province receive education and training in terms of how to work with queer seniors. And the reason why in the short term, it's for us who are going into these settings to have a better life and not have to be oppressed any further. But also, as my queer young friends are getting older, to change the system. Because, you know, we all are going to need some kind of care as we get older. And I don't want my queer young friends to be going through what I see happening to queer seniors now. So that it angered me, but it's re-energized me. And that is my mission now, to make change happen and to continue to make change happen. And to continue to work with you in some capacity and with queer youth, because I agree, arts and music, especially music for queer folks, is so important moving forward, and arts moving forward in terms of, you know, bringing peace to your soul and giving you that kind of peace of mind. So that's where I see myself. Yep. So it's been a pleasure. Every time I talk to you, I learn more things about you.
I like to throw little additions when we spice it up a little.
So thank you. Thank you for doing this, you know, having this conversation. And now we'll throw it over to Jean.
Hi. Just from the bottom of my heart, I just got to say thank you so much for your generosity in telling your stories, your vulnerability in telling your stories, and your the incredible amount of education you bring into this space by doing that, especially to us white folks. Like, I can't thank you enough for this time. And I could listen to you both talk forever and ever. And so, yeah, thank you so much for doing this today. And I'm so happy that you have this beautiful, beautiful relationship and safety with one another. So thank you. We do have a few questions in the chat.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, so Lisa Streifler says, fascinating conversation. Thank you, leZlie. You alluded to the nuns making you a lesbian. Could you give us an insight into that comment?
So thank you for the question, Lisa. I was just interviewed. There's a guy by the name of Trevor Campbell. You should look him up. And he does this show, What Made You Queer? And I said, the nuns made me queer because they were so into turning us against men, but trying to make us good wives at the same time. Because in the convent, you're groomed to become something in life, and the only thing you could become in life if you didn't have math and geometry and algebra, I was told by the nuns, I was destined to only be good enough to be a wife. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to be a wife to serve men. But the joke is, they turn you off of men. So what's left? Is women. and there's a saying amongst the sisters that nuns don't get none, nuns get a lot. I've met so many ex-Catholic nuns who are lesbian. It's like unbelievable. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. What other questions? I have some comments. Janelle said, such a great conversation. Regine says, Trinidad and Tobago became independent from Britain in 1962. Kale says, I have to leave for another meeting. My apologies. This has been a wonderful talk. Blair says, wonderful, generous conversation. leZlie and Ty reiterating everything Jean is saying. Hallie says, this has been so wonderful. Thank you both for sharing candidly. And Blair says, I think you're both wonderfully funny individuals. Wondering if you could talk about how humor might help you in your work and life.
Ty.
Not a funny person.
Did you say you're not a funny person?
What the heck?
Yeah, really?
You know what? Humor is such a privilege. And I say this because I envy comedians and comedic storytellers. They get to take their traumas or their experiences and use humor to either take away or add power back into their story. And when it comes to like me talking to leZlie or me being in an interpersonal way, humor comes up organically because I laugh at myself a lot. But I'm kind of a serious, quiet person. And so I get the privilege of when I get to be with someone like leZlie or some of my other kin, where they get to see me feel confident and safe enough to be humorous.
Yeah. Well, I take that as a compliment, Ty.
You should.
Yeah. So for me, humor is important. As I said, growing up, Trinidadians are very funny people. Like we're joking constantly about stuff. And then when I came here, as I said earlier, in order for me to survive, I had to turn the oppression against me into humor. And more recently, I have been doing a bit about, I'm being read as trans now because of what I look like. That's why my descriptor on the Zoom, my name is gender mysterious, because people decide on my gender for me based on what I look like. So I have been having a problem for, I would say, the past 4 years now, going into women's washrooms and being read as a man and being read as a trans man. So at first I was really angry because I've been physically assaulted going into women's washrooms. And then it made me think about my older trans women friends who are being harassed and being assaulted going into women's washrooms, but they're afraid to speak up. And I have the privilege and the power, and I've given the platform many opportunities to speak out. So I created a bit about what it's like going into women's washrooms. And one of the ones, so they usually come up to me and say, well, first they scream, and it depends on the kinds of venues where you're going into the washrooms. And I've noticed it, if you go into a public washroom, say in a restaurant or a movie theater, the women scream, oh, there's a man in here. And then I started, just before COVID, I was going to theaters a lot. And the crowd was different. It was, do you know where you are? These women would come up to me as I'm standing in the line. Do you know where you are? And I said, yeah, I'm in the line in the women's washroom. And finally, I decided I'm going to turn this around on them. So one of them came up, do you know where you are? And I said, yes, I'm on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Yeah, so for me, humor, I have to, because if I didn't laugh, I would cry. Yeah. And Ty and I both know when we walk out our front doors every day, you never know what the world is going to throw at you. And the other piece that I do is, I keep being called sir every time I go to buy something. And again, I used to get angry. And now what I've decided to do is when somebody calls me sir, I say, let's turn this into a teaching moment. And then the line starts to form behind me and the person starts apologizing. Yeah. So humor for me is important.
Thank you for that, both of you. Regine has a question. Regine, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Sure. I can't see myself in the thing. I don't know if y'all are seeing or hearing me.
Yeah,
Are you?
I can
We
see
can hear you.
Okay, I can't see it on mine. Hello, once again.
Oh, I know you.
Yeah, I know. I enjoyed the last conversation so much when I saw y'all doing this Zoom today. I decided to come back. So a lot of what you guys said resonated with me, leZlie, you in particular. I do have a question for you though, leZlie, is that when you were talking about like your experiences in Trinidad and coming here, for me, it would be the opposite, having spent a lot of time here and then going there. So for me, when I go, it's a lot of culture shock, but I try to, eat local. Everything is a big culture shock. I remember when I first went for Carnival because that was a big thing because I'm so used to doing Caribana. But my question for you is, how do you fill the void with the balance with identity? Like when you like trying to fit the void is like having acclimatized here and then going back. Like because I find that for me is that I know like I resonate more with my Trini, but then I also know that I'm Canadian as well. But so I'm always having to balance like the two because of the differences between the two. Like there are some things that I would connect and say, yeah, I'm Canadian because of this, and then say, yes, I'm Trinidad because of that. But sometimes I can never really bridge the two with some aspects. And I find that when I do go, is even though yes, I'm resonating with the people, is that I don't necessarily know how to interact with them sometimes because you know how sometimes I get called a foreigner. I get called a foreigner, and it's just like, they'll come and tell you, well, you don't know anything, you're a foreigner, you're coming from foreign, you don't know.
Exactly.
Right. So it's like there's that, and I find I have to like acclimatized in a place that I haven't been acclimatized. So how do you find that? How do you fill like the void between the two identities? Like I don't know if you've gone back since.
Oh yeah, I actually was there in 2018. And so for people who don't know, like Regine was just saying, when you go back, and I've heard other friends of color who go back like to the Philippines, and they're told you're foreign, you look like them, but as soon as you open your mouth, they know that you haven't lived there for a long time. So the first thing, like you said, I'm told, oh, you're foreign. That you hand the immigration person your passport, they look at it, and they say, oh, you're foreign. You're not one of us anymore. And then being queer in Trinidad, I was lucky enough to connect in 2018 with the organizers of Pride T&T, Pride Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad now has Pride, but it's all sort of undercover still. But what I have found that happens, and it happened when I was there the last time, I'm walking down the street with a friend and we're going shopping, and this guy across the street shouts out, oh, you Zami, you need a good man. So Zami is a derogatory term. It's now been reclaimed for lesbians in the Caribbean. So I looked at him and I said to him, really? Would you want somebody to say something like that to your mother or your sister or your auntie? And, and then he said, oh, sorry. I said, yeah, but why did you even feel the need to say anything? And you're looking at me, I'm an older person and I'm using a cane, and this is how you behave. So I've gotten to the point, Regine, where I just speak up.
Yeah, because drawing on that, I don't mean to cut you off, but drawing on that is that it's become, I realize that with going there, like I love the place when I go, but then now as I like the last 2 or 3 trips that I've been back is like, I feel like I have to disconnect because I'm starting to learn more about like the way that people interact. And I don't necessarily like how, like I know that it's a cultural thing too. Like, you know, we joke around, we call people certain names and it's like a cultural thing. But then sometimes it's just like, how far is too much?
Yeah.
Like how far is too much? Like for example,
I don't tolerate any kind of homophobic behavior or language. Yeah.
Because it's just because a big thing for me now, I don't want to delve too much, is that I've always had aspirations about going back to Trinidad. I've always had, just because it's very different for me and the type of culture that it is. But then now I don't really have the same aspirations that I had. And the reason why so is because racism is a big thing for me now down there, because I recently, because I was just like, well, I don't know necessarily like the next time that I go back, because last time I was there was 4 years ago. And then between, like, I haven't been back since because of COVID and everything, but I started to look at it in terms of the racial aspect, like what would I have to deal with if I were to move back or just go and spend some time? And I don't like this idea of, like, I look like them, I sound like them, but then it's just like, how long before somebody looks at me and classifies me as either an Indian C, a Black N, or a mixed Douglas?
So this is a whole other conversation for people. You know what? I had asked you to get in touch with me. So wait until we are wrapped up, and I'll give you my phone number and my email again.
Okay.
And then we can have a conversation.
All right.
Because just in case anybody else wants to ask a question, but I can totally relate to what you're saying, but let's have a separate conversation.
Yeah. All right. Everybody, sorry for holding up the line.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Thank you so much, Regine. I just wanted to mention, leZlie has to leave right away, but I just wanted to thank you both again. And I really want to thank Ty, because when we first chatted, Ty was like, I'm here to support leZlie. And I'm so happy that you shared your story. And you were, I just loved hearing everything you said. And I'm so glad that you took that space and time to share everything you did. There's enough stars. There's enough starlight for both of you, and I'm so happy that you both shone, as you always do here today.
And Ty, I appreciate you making the time, because I know how busy you are. So thank you so much for doing this. Oh, there's Aiden. Hi, Aiden.
But leZlie, I know you have an important conversation.
Yes, so I have Jean, if you could just give Regine my phone number.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Great. So I have to run. Thank you, Ty. Thank you, Jean and Soag. And thank you so much to the 2 lovely interpreters.
Yes, thank you to the lovely interpreters. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.